Welcome to today's class of the seminar Organizing in Times of Crisis, the Case of War and Armed Conflict. My name is Maximilian Heimstädt. I'm a senior researcher at Bielefeld University and head of the research group Reorganizing Knowledge Practices at Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin. Over the course of this seminar, you learn about many different challenges that come up in times of crisis. You also learn about different ways in which organizing can help us to address these challenges. Of course, none of these forms of organizing are a quick fix, yet, taken together, they might actually make a difference for the well-being of people involved in this tragic crisis. The challenge that we focus on today is what I call the challenge of epistemic uncertainty. With epistemic uncertainty, I refer to the challenge that in times of crisis, established bodies of knowledge and forms of producing and certifying knowledge seem to have stopped working, or at least they face severe problems. In other words, what is true and false, what we can and cannot know, becomes much more contested in times of crisis than in normal times. In times of crisis, this epistemic uncertainty increases for at least two reasons. The first reason is that we usually perceive a crisis as something that is unprecedented. Knowledge that might help us to navigate the crisis has therefore not been created yet. A good example for this is the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure you all have rather vivid memories of that time. We quickly agreed that while there have been pandemics before, this one is definitely different. The spread was rapid, the population density very high, and the type of the virus was new as well. There was no vaccine in place, and it was unclear whether we will even be able to develop one. From this first reason for epistemic uncertainty follows a second one. The lack of relative scientific or journalistic consensus around facts in times of crisis not only leaves room for unfounded speculation, but also for actors who deliberately fabricate misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy narratives. While these phenomena exist in normal times as well, they get amplified in times of crisis and supported by the algorithmically sorted digital publics of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Based on this sensitizing concept, the guiding question I set out to address in this lecture, therefore, is: what are forms of organizing that can reduce epistemic uncertainty in times of armed conflict and war? To answer this question, let us begin by briefly looking back at the COVID-19 crisis. A key challenge back then, so in 2020 and 2021, was that the public had a great interest in the latest scientific findings on the new coronavirus. But journalists had a very hard time diving deep into the latest biomedical research. For most of them, this was a rather tangential topic before the pandemic, and the world of biomedical sciences was also one that was really hard to understand as a layperson and even as a journalist. Over time, new forms of organizing came to the fore that helped reducing this epistemic uncertainty. One of these forms of organizing are so-called science media centers. Science media centers are organizations that work like brokers between scientific communities and journalists. Science media centers constantly search for topics that might be of great interest to journalists in the near future. Once they identify an issue, for example, a new type of virus, they reach out to different scientists who work on these issues, collect their expertise, and condense this expertise into press briefings. Journalists can then use these press briefings as raw material for their reporting, instead of reaching out to all the different scientists themselves. Now, fast forward to our current crisis, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Like the pandemic, this crisis has resulted in a surge of epistemic uncertainty. Many new questions begin to circulate. Many of them will sound overly familiar and relevant to you. What are the strategic goals behind the invasion? How does the conflict play out on the ground? Are civilians hurt? In what way will the war affect other European countries? Unlike the COVID-19 pandemic, the epistemic uncertainty of war and armed conflict is not one that can primarily be reduced by reorganizing scientific knowledge production and diffusion. A science media center won't be of much help here. In the case of war and armed conflict, the main challenge is to produce timely journalistic knowledge on a geographic area that is vast and where collecting evidence on the ground is very dangerous and at times costly. I suggest that we can visualize this epistemic uncertainty something like this. So on the one hand, there's a rather traditional centralized journalism that relies a lot on making connections on the ground and getting their own people on the ground in regions of war and armed conflict. This takes time and a lot of resources. On the other hand, we have these specific types of events that take place in wars, which are distributed, very dynamic, and constantly evolving. And there's a certain mismatch, this epistemic uncertainty between this form of reporting and the type of situation that is reported on. So, reiterating our guiding question for today. What are forms of organizing that can reduce epistemic uncertainty around the Russian invasion of Ukraine? There are numerous examples of outstanding journalistic efforts during this crisis. However, today I will focus on one organization that stands out for the novelty and, arguably, the success of its reporting. The name of the organization is bellingcat. Bellingcat is an investigative journalism group. It was founded in 2014 by the British journalist and former blogger Elliot Higgins. That's the gentleman on the right. The organization started in the UK, but due to Brexit moved to Amsterdam. Today it has an office in Berlin as well. As of 2019, the organization had 16 full-time staff and at least 60 long-standing volunteer contributors. Bellingcat focuses on investigations on war zones and human rights abuses. The organization worked on many of the most dramatic crises and wars in the last years, including the Syrian civil war, the Yemeni civil war, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, the work that Bellingcat does and the way this work is coordinated differs from other, more established forms of investigative journalism. They call this the Bellingcat method. So, what is the Bellingcat method? Bellingcat started as an amateur project of people who wanted to support the collective search for journalistic truth but had very limited resources. So instead of flying into countries where wars or armed conflict was taking place, the first members of Bellingcat, initially a loose group of people who have met online, started investigating these situations using only digital, openly available information. Today, they also refer to this as open source intelligence. It is no surprise that the start of Bellingcat in 2014 coincided with a time where the availability of this openly available information increased drastically, not at least through the rise of social media platforms and the ubiquity of smartphones. The Bellingcat method involves using all sorts of digital information, photos from social media sites like Twitter, or videos from YouTube or TikTok. Members of bellingcat use social media profiles to link people on photographs or in videos to names. Then they would, for example, use these names to find out more about the social network of these individuals, where they work, and what the names of their co-workers and thereby other people on their photos are. Finally, a large part of the work of bellingcat is the geolocation of photographs and videos. To geolocate a photo, bellingcat journalists use Google Earth, so satellite images, to match topological features on photos, such as a house or a hill, with these features on satellite images. So, overall, you could say that the bellingcat method is a combination of open crowdsourcing of information fragments and a more close process of verification where the core group of bellingcat members then takes this crowdsourced information and triangulates it and kind of turns it into a more narrative form of reporting. Let me give you a recent example for the bellingcat method. On March 11th, bellingcat released a report on the use of cluster munition in areas of Ukraine where many civilians live. Cluster munition is a type of weapon that is notorious for causing harm to civilians during war and armed conflict. These weapons consist of 3 parts: a cargo warhead, submunition inside the warhead, and a rocket motor. You can see all these components on the screenshot here, which is taken from a video that was co-produced by bellingcat. At some point, the submunition is released from the warhead, which together with the motor continues its trajectory. The bellingcat team set out to identify warheads as well as remainders of submunition. They collected images of these parts on social media and with the help of dozens of civilians living in the area, as well as volunteers searching the web for photos uploaded by these civilians. Bellingcat members would then cross-compare these photos with satellite images of Ukrainian cities to geolocate the individual parts of the weapon. So, for example, the tweet on the left-hand side is by Elliot Higgins, the founder of bellingcat. In this tweet, he calls out to send him pictures or to link these pictures under this original tweet. And he also gives kind of a guide what people who come across submunition or warheads should look out for and kind of add this information as metadata to the photo. So, for example, numbers that are written on the parts they identified. On the right-hand side, you see one of these accounts responding to the initial call by Elliot Higgins. So this account is, at least according to the profile, not officially affiliated with bellingcat, but it's more of an individual volunteer who also supports this idea of open source intelligence and searching for truth through triangulation of photographic data. Combining geolocations of the warhead and the submunitions finally allowed bellingcat to identify the general direction of the rocket that's indicated by the red lines in the photograph here, released by bellingcat. Through this method and knowledge about the range of this weapon, also derived from openly available sources and military experts online, the group could affirm that cluster munition was fired from Russian territory. So, we now learned how bellingcat, through this very new and innovative way of doing investigative journalism, the bellingcat method, attempted, and in my understanding successfully attempted, to reduce the epistemic uncertainty between centralized journalism and the distributed events in Ukraine. However, from an organization studies perspective, there is also a second quite important question that comes up from the case of bellingcat. So if we look at studies about new journalism startups, we find that many of them fail within a few years. So the number might even be higher than for other sorts of startups. In most cases, successful methods like the bellingcat method or successful individuals within these journalism startups would then move into more traditional media firms. However, now almost 10 years after the founding of bellingcat, this has not been the case. bellingcat has thrived and developed to a group of almost 24 full-time employees. So how did bellingcat survive, grow, and stabilize as an organization in the highly competitive field of journalism? Organization scholars more generally speak about this puzzle as the liability of newness. It's the observation that the risk of failure for an organization is the highest at the start of the new venture and decreases the older the venture gets. So the puzzling question here is, of course, what are strategies to overcome this liability of newness? And the literature here knows loads of these strategies. So among the most prominent ones are building a network with other entrepreneurs, selecting the right location and ecosystem for your new venture, or, for example, hiring industry experts as consultants for your new venture that help you to overcome the first bumpy month or years. A fourth strategy is building social acceptance with important stakeholders, so gaining legitimacy. This gaining legitimacy with important stakeholders seems particularly relevant for journalistic startups because they don't have a tangible product at their core. So if you have a patent on a fascinating new technology, building legitimacy for that technology is also not unimportant, but it's not as central as with journalists. Why? The social acceptance of journalistic organization is primarily built on the trust of their readers. Journalists usually protect their sources in order to produce journalistic accounts. Readers, then on the other hand, need to trust journalists that these sources are accurate. We basically know this dynamic, and we know that when breakdowns of trust occur in traditional or centralized journalism, it's very important that this trust needs to be repaired, and that's very difficult. You have probably followed the controversy around Klaas Relotius, a reporter for the German news magazine Der Spiegel, who exploited this trust and, as came to the light of day later on, faked sources. So my argument would be that what's so interesting about the bellingcat case is that they did not overcome this liability of newness through a rapid creation of trust in the traditional sense, but by adopting a strategy of radical transparency around their reporting. So, for example, their entire collection of information was out in the open. We've seen this screenshot of Elliot Higgins beforehand, where he called openly in his Twitter post to send him pictures and to link these pictures openly under the original tweet. The members of bellingcat openly discuss ongoing investigations in forums, for example, on Reddit. The bellingcat group on their website publishes detailed manuals and guides for doing the bellingcat method. So, for example, how to retrieve information from online sources. The bellingcat team also doesn't keep their method for themselves, or maybe the last details of the method, but they go out and train other journalists in the bellingcat method. So, in my reading of the case, bellingcat managed to overcome the liabilities of newness by turning their greatest weakness, the lack of sources on the ground, or let's say the alleged weakness by traditional standards of journalism, into their greatest strength. They shifted the playing field, and instead of competing on the grounds of trust with other established journalistic ventures, they introduced transparency as a new quality dimension. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on organizing facts in a post-truth condition. In the post-lecture assignment, you have the opportunity to dig a little bit further into bellingcat's transparency strategy. If you have any suggestions, ideas, or further readings in relation to this seminar, feel free to post them in the comment section of the YouTube video or reach out to me on Twitter or via email. Goodbye.